I'm at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the national labs exist to provide scientific solutions to our nation's greatest challenges. And we have a number of different missions. We grew out of the Manhattan Project and have a traditional mission in defense, and over time that's expanded more to be national security in general. And that encompasses many different submissions. We work in energy, materials, environment, just many different things that affect the overall well-being of the country. One of our missions is education. We bring in a number of students and postdocs every year and provide direct hands-on training for some of our scientists of the future. We do have a focus on STEM fields. We also have a number of outreach activities. As you heard earlier, New Mexico is a very poor state. The lab has programs that provide outreach to our neighboring communities, providing training for teachers, particularly in the math and science areas. Many of our employees do a lot of volunteer work both in our own community and in the surrounding communities. So we really see both ends of things, where our own community is very fortunate, and yet we're surrounded by an area that really has some significant needs in the education area. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how we use data visualization and statistics as powerful tools for extracting insights from education data. We can use both analysis and modeling to enable informative visualizations, and we like to be able to look at both individual behavior and also the behavior of overall populations. As we've been hearing, there's just more and more data out there. And so there's actually a lot of research needed to deal with how do we actually deal with these large quantities of data and make sense out of them. And the goal of this, of course, would be to be able to do informed decision making and help support good analyses for good policies to get things done. I'd like to acknowledge there's a number of people who've contributed to this presentation in many ways. Both my colleagues at LANL and also some of my colleagues and collaborators. As Paul mentioned, we had a recent project that I'll be talking about a little further into the talk, where we did some simulation modeling, and that was a joint project between us, UT Austin, and UC Santa Cruz, and we also had input from other people from the educational community. So I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the things I'm talking about are stuff that other people have either done or contributed to. I'm going to start off by talking about some statistical visualizations of some data from New Mexico, specifically from the Los Alamos schools. And then I'll talk about our agent-based approach for education modeling that we've been developing. And then I'll wrap up with some broader integrated statistics and computer science visualization research. Our local school district has been looking at we have a report card in place in New Mexico to help evaluate the schools, and has a number of different things that are looked at. And the idea is to sort of, we grade our kids, let's grade the schools. And so a lot of the stuff that goes into this is based on test scores. And people in our town are very analytical and ask lots of questions. So there's always a lot of interest in trying to understand, what's behind the ratings. And so one of the statisticians in the group that I lead was asked to help out and take a look at some of this data. So if we look at the scaled math scores that occurred in the schools, and also we have scaled reading scores here, you can see paths of what student trajectories look like. But it's a little hard to make sense out of this. You just get a big kind of cloud of lines. And then if you look at averages, then you get to start seeing what the overall trend is. And then if we can do analyses, we can actually try to identify, is there actually a change? And so in this particular example, one of the years did seem to have a statistically significant uptick in the reading scores. So I'm just going to show you some of the different things. These would be more in the exploratory category, just different ways that we as scientists look at data and try to make sense out of what initially might look like a big confusing mess of points, and we try to find trends and identify patterns in data that we can draw conclusions about. This is an example where we're looking at math scores as children progress from one year to the next. And so you can plot the points themselves, but you can also look at the differences from one year to the next. So on the left, we have a bunch of, points. And yes, there's certainly, a relationship between the two. But if we make a histogram of the differences, it's a little more insightful, and you can actually look at, well, what are the sizes of the changes and what is the distribution? So in statistics, distributions are sort of our bread and butter. We think that way all the time. We're always thinking how there's a whole set of individuals, and they make up that overall distribution. And we use that in many different types of scientific problems. This is looking at the 5 different elementary schools in our district. And again, looking at changes in math scores. This is from 2011 to 2012. And so we can make the individual plots. And then what's been done here is there's actually been some statistical tests conducted. And then you'll see there's a black dot here in this corner. That indicates that there was, you can kind of see the points are a little bit above the line, indicating that there was some improvement indicated, at least from a statistical basis. There were also some places where there was actually an indication that maybe things actually went down. When you're doing a lot of tests like this, you have to be careful because the standard probability rates that come along with tests, you have to actually adjust them when you do lots of tests like this. So all of this needs to kind of be taken with a grain of salt. One thing the statistician did here is he said, well, here's 1 year, let's look at the next and see if we see those trends again. Well, so again, we see some places where new dots appeared. Probably the most interesting one is that at this particular school, they did get the improvement 2 years in a row. So that's a little stronger evidence that maybe there really is some growth going on at that particular school. So that's just an example of one of the types of analyses. This is another example of some of the work that's been done and looking at both reading and math scores and looking at changes at, we don't know, is it a 1-year growth you're looking for, or do you need to combine different years, and you might see a different picture depending, how many years worth of data are included. So this is looking at some different time periods for both reading and math. And then the letters here mark the 5 Los Alamos schools relative to other schools within our state. And so it gives us some idea of where our schools are and where there might be changes during different time periods. And then we might just focus in on one particular type of test. Or actually, I guess this one is averaged across some of the different tests. And again, it gives our local community some idea of like where our schools stand. There's some more advanced techniques that can be used. I mean, this is actually a fairly simple one, an ANOVA model, but compared to what a lot of the analyses are, even sort of just applying a model can be a step forward. A lot of educational data tends to be summarized in tables, and it's helpful to use some of the other statistical techniques that are available to understand what's going on. In this example, they were trying to figure out, is there an effect from different schools in looking at growth? So they can plot all the schools, and then they actually fit a model, and were able to do statistical testing. And in this case, they did not find a significant school effect for growth, because you can plot these other types of plots that show they put bounds on the behavior from the model. So we have an ANOVA model, and we can put bounds on what our predictions are, and we can look in, I don't know if I guess they do show up. You look within your statistical bounds. Everything kind of is right where it's, it lies within there. So we're not seeing a lot of difference that's associated with the different schools here. So that was an example of just looking at data. So one of the things that we've been trying to work toward is an agent-based simulation model for a school system. So we'd like to sort of say, okay, we can collect data. What are some of the other things we can do? We can't always experiment on the children and try all the different things in the schools. There are some structured studies that make sense, but if we could do it in a simulated world, then maybe we can learn some things that we couldn't actually learn as quickly or as efficiently as we could with a model. So we worked with UC Santa Cruz, UT Austin, and some of our other collaborators, and we spent a lot of time meeting with educators and learning about schools and and how people think of them, and came up with a model. And this is patterned after some models that were developed for transportation systems. So the national labs have done extensive studies of cities and their transportation systems. For example, Portland, Oregon is one of the sites that they've done extensive traffic modeling. They've gone and done surveys and found out, they actually go and figure out what are the activities that people do as they go through their day. They go, they get up, they go to work, they drop their children off somewhere, they pick them up. And so they have a lot of real data that they then use to create simulated data. And then they're able to do studies and look at things like, well, what if we added a bridge here, or we took a road out here? What would the impact be? So our goal is to apply some of those same strategies in the educational area. So we have developed a small prototype system at this point, primarily just to demonstrate how we would go about doing this if we were able to obtain the resources to do this for an extended period of time to really get the detailed modeling done. So we would set up, in the agent-based approach, you actually have entities in your model. Like in this example, we have 3 schools, A, B, and C, and then there's classrooms within the schools, teachers within the classrooms, and then students get assigned. So we have an assignment mechanism that will take the student units and assign them, and we have different strategies for doing that. And so we try to simulate the structure of the school system, and then we also develop score functions that mathematically describe how the students progress as they move from year to year. So this is a visual representation of a score assignment where you end up with students in the different classrooms, and they get assigned different types of scores, and then over time they move from classroom to classroom and progress through their educational experience. We can look at individual tracks showing a particular student in the simulation moving through time. And again, this is quite similar to the stuff we saw in the real data from the Los Alamos example, where you will see a lot of variability. It's not like a student will, and these are scaled scores, so that's why it looks like they're not progressing, but it's just an indication of paths going through time, and we try to understand, what happens when we assign them in different ways. So in this example, the students were grouped by ability, and then if you compare that, this is one where they were done in a completely random way. So just depending how our model's set up, we can experiment and try some of these different things. If we look at both actual and simulated data, this is part of how we calibrate our model. So we built a model kind of based on our theoretical understanding after talking to educators of how we thought a system would work. But then we had a large data set from San Jose that we used to actually get real data to help train our simulation model. So we did not attempt to directly analyze all the information in the San Jose database. It's actually quite rich. They've got something like 63 million records, and they have very detailed data on students, not just their test scores, but they have a lot of information on socioeconomic variables. They do surveys of the students to find out how the climate of the school is affecting them. It's quite an extensive database, and one of the really nice things is it has student data individually over several years' time, so you can really track the students as they progress through the system. So this was perfect for our purposes in terms of getting data that had came from students who actually moved through a system like the one we were attempting to model. In our calibration procedure, we actually tried to come up with the mathematical representation of the model actually includes this scoring function, and it assigns scores to the students' performance based on things like the level of the students in the class they're in, their scores from the previous year. It starts from their basic reading scores. So there's various things that get updated over time. And then in the end, we end up with a distribution of students. We do not necessarily try to have each student have a prediction, but we do try to get the overall population behavior to match what happens with the real data. So we look at that distribution, say, of something like math scores, and we have lots of different weights we could put into our model, but we try to, what we do is we run many, many computer runs if you were doing this in a big way, you'd probably do something, like 100,000 runs. I think these studies were probably done with maybe 1,000. Actually, I think it was 10,000. And so then we look for the parameters. We try lots of different combinations, and we choose those that give us a distribution that's most like what we see with the actual data. So you can see in the upper left, we have the actual distribution, and the other three indicate other distributions that we modeled by choosing different parameter values. So if you look at the lower right, that was the absolute worst fit. It really does not look at all like the population. There's an arbitrary run in the upper right. That one's not bad, but it doesn't match well. And then the lower left was our best fit. And so we have a couple of different ways to do this, and we calculate matching scores of how well does the distribution we get from the simulation match the distribution of the actual data. And so these are the types of techniques we use to train our models and come up with ways to incorporate real data into our simulated model. Then once we do this calibration process, there's the weights in there correspond to things in our score function. So you can look at the weights, and at this time we haven't really been able to delve into it to see if there's clear patterns with the weights. It could simply be thought of as an empirical relationship at this point. But we looked at this, the set of weights that matched the best, and the average classroom ability came out as our most important factor. Student ability was also very important, with somewhat smaller contributions from the score from the previous year, and also the teacher ability. And in the ability, that was also obtained from, that's probably a kind of a loaded label for it, but we looked at the data from the San Jose schools, and we looked at all students who were exposed to a certain teacher and how their performance changed, and then it was averaged over several years, and so that gave us a variable to use there. But again, this is work that's sort of preliminary, and we think there's a lot of potential in using this approach. And what would be nice is it would allow us to a lot of different things. One is it avoids things like sensitive data. The national labs are used to working with a lot of information that needs to be protected. So our vision is that we could have a lot of this data that needs to be protected, but generate synthetic data that could be used by researchers across the country for studying different phenomena, and we could generate it for different situations where they would need data. We had this relationship with the San Jose schools to use their data, and longer term it would be really exciting if we could get data sets from across the country and be able to pull that in and use that for different types of analyses. And then I was just going to mention some of the other visualization research that I'm involved in at Los Alamos. We're part of a computer computational and statistical sciences division, and the other groups in our division do a lot of things with high performance computing, visualization, big data. And so that's been really helpful to us in developing collaborations with them. We're looking at things like very large scale simulations for some of our engineering calculations, and we're doing what's called in situ analysis, where we look at data while a simulation is running, and we can use that to make decisions about what data to actually store permanently. We can look for what are the interesting features. We can do things like if we have a simulation with thousands and thousands of frames in it, we can identify what are the important key steps in the simulation where there's interesting things going on. We're also looking at data transformations in the context of understanding simulation models. As somebody mentioned earlier, we're kind of getting overwhelmed with this data. So one important way of dealing with large data is using sampling techniques. So you have to think very carefully if you're going to reduce your data down, what's an appropriate way to do it? And there's a lot of different statistical sampling strategies that can be brought in to make sure that you're sampling down in a way that makes sense and that you're getting good representative information. I'm also working with an artist, Francesca Samsel, who's actually here at UT Austin. And we're looking at things with color and perception that impact how the humans visualizing something perceive the colors. Another thing we look at is uncertainty bounds on things. Uncertainty is a really important thing in any decision. We don't want just estimates. We want to know how sure are we, how much does that value vary. And so there's a lot of different uncertainty techniques within the field of statistics. And when you have multiple variables, that can be kind of challenging, particularly when you don't know the type of distribution the data is from. And finally, we're working on implementing real-time processing techniques for decision support, where we would be able to pull in information instantaneously from across the country. We have a proposal in development now to do this for studying flu, but you could imagine a system like this could also be very helpful in the educational arena. Just a couple of these examples about what I mean with big data and sampling. The pictures shown here illustrate data from a cosmological simulation. So these are used to study the origins of the universe. So there's physics models set up, and it generates points in space that represent dark matter. Well, if you look at all of the data from the simulation as it's shown on the far left, that's not very informative. It's just a big white cube. If we sample it and we thin it down, then we begin to see structure. And so this is a really important thing that you run into in big data. Statistics was originally designed for when you had limited data and you wanted to draw inferences. Today, statistics needs to address very large sources of data and trying to determine how can we even bring this stuff down to a level where we can do an analysis that makes sense. I mentioned the color and perception work, and a lot of the color maps that are in use today are perhaps suboptimal, and so we're working with an artist and trying to combine mathematics and art to come up with good color schemes that will be informative. And so we'll be doing some user studies to see if our theories actually pan out, and if the maps that we're developing are actually superior to the ones currently used in practice. And I also had mentioned the uncertainty regions. We're in the process of developing mathematical techniques for calculating these probability bounds. We're at a point where we can calculate contours of our distributions, but there's actually another step that we have to work through to get to the point where we can assign probabilities to these contours. And this is something where it's going to be really important when we have large amounts of data to have quick computational strategies to do this kind of thing. And when we work on this sort of stuff, we are in a very nice position working with some of the top computer scientists in the country, because we need to tap into things like the newer hardware like GPUs and things like that that can do very, very fast computations, but then we have to adapt our analysis strategies so that we can actually figure out how to send stuff around to different processors and computers, both for the computations and the data management. So that's a really big challenge we face, is with all this huge data, how do we actually compute the stuff? How do we store it? How do we transfer it? How do we transmit it? Some of this stuff is going to be done by moving computations to where the data is. So rather than taking all the data and bringing it to Los Alamos, for something like education, we would want to have something set up where computation was distributed around the country, and perhaps summary results would all come back together. So I just wanted to thank Paul for inviting me, and it's really great getting to meet with all of you.